Good evening, all. Tonight we are going to discuss Friedrich Nietzsche and John Stuart Mill. So, we're going to skip a bit of the scope here and really just get right into it. Okay? There's really two primary ways that people contribute to philosophy. One is through that rigorously analytical study that's built on logic that we've already talked about, but the other is through the use of aphorisms, which are kind of pithy little statements, but that can penetrate to our personal reflection. And the one who did this best was Friedrich Nietzsche. So he was born in Germany, grew up rather sickly, lived with his mother and his sister until he died from the effects of tertiary syphilis in 1900, so seeing us to the end of the early modern era. Now, Nietzsche was a writer of really great power and had these dark, suggestive, daring ideas. Nietzsche's ideas go kind of far away from Matthew Arnold's Sweetness and Light, which we discussed before, but there's kind of a common bond between them. They're not really addressing the classical schoolroom or the lecture, but rather the public at large. And so, where Arnold said there's something that inclines us to be Greek, Nietzsche wants to know which of those Greeks. We've got Apollo and reason on one side, and Dionysus and the ecstasy on the other side. So Schopenhauer had influenced Nietzsche. Schopenhauer basically said that the world is our idea. There's nothing more certain than that the whole world is only object in relation to subject. Something you may recall that Bishop Berkeley said very similarly. So, this subjectification of knowledge is going to be a real starting point for Nietzsche. So, Schopenhauer says at the end of the day, all we really want to do is survive. But that's going to kind of wear thin for Nietzsche. The will to survive, he said, no, we don't want to survive, we want power. Progress is going to be kind of a consequence of this move as we destroy things to get what we really want. And so his first really well known work is called The Birth of Tragedy and the Spirit of Music. And he contrasts Apollo and Dionysus, these two faces of the Greek world, as the art deities. So Greek tragedy is trying to resolve conflict and relax the tension between these two. So think of a show that you watch on a regular basis. The Dionysian aspect of that show is the surprise ending or the plot twist or something that changes suddenly to give it a little bit more interest. The Apollonian aspect of the show is the overarching story arc or the plot or the coherence or what have you. So Nietzsche said, really these academic philosophers, they focus too much on the reason of Apollo and not enough on Dionysus and ecstasy. Wagner, Richard Wagner, or Richard Wagner if you prefer, was one of the contemporaries of Nietzsche who wrote the Nibelungenlied and Götterdämmerung and all of these other, basically the ring cycle. And his operas are going to shape Nietzsche's idea of what the Obermann, the one who will overcome, who kind of comes and replaces the weak contemporary being of man. Both of these guys were influenced by Schopenhauer. They were both very interested in the mythical and heroical worlds of the Greeks and the Norsemen. Wagner's operas were based on Norse myth rather than on Greek myth, but still a lot of the same themes there. Now, I'm sorry you had to see this. Society has to take in the Dionysian passions and that uncontrolled will to power by taming people and their passions. So Nietzsche understands that much of what we do in this is really kind of a sublimation. A limina in Latin is the threshold across your doorway, the bottom of it. Something is liminal if it's in the realm that we're aware of. Something is subliminal or has been sublimated if it's been pushed below that awareness. So subliminal marketing might include people drinking a popular soda and doing something fun, as opposed to drinking that popular soda while sitting in a boring gray office cubicle. This is going to play in heavily into Freud's psychoanalytic theory. Now, the only one that's capable of living this authentic life and not having to sublimate things and not have to give up their Dionysian impulses is the Obermann. And Nietzsche says the only person that really came close to this was Goethe, who we discussed before in his writing about Faust. And he said this guy actually lived his life authentically and close to his aesthetic vocation. The Enlightenment, and even Darwin, is kind of an evolutionary process. We're constantly improving and refining. But wait a minute, if we actually look at human history, that doesn't seem to be the case. It also shows us that really history is more made up of these cycles of brutality that every once in a while we interrupt with creative energy. Every act of creation is an act of destruction. Okay. So the blue figure that you see in the lower right there is the Hindu god Shiva. Shiva is a creator, but also a destroyer. Now, Nietzsche had real problems with Judeo-Christian teaching, not that not that it itself is bad or its practitioners are bad, but that it doesn't have this impulse to power. And so there seems to be something kind of off about it for Nietzsche. There's a maximum in his philosophy that we almost have to embrace suffering, mistrust, and rejection of comforting things to us. Suffering almost has to be kind of a goal. Now, we will suffer, knowing that there is no happy ending to this, and Nietzsche dies relatively young at 56. He had collapsed in a public street in Turin, Italy. And where that leaves us off is, well, not overly satisfied with Nietzsche, but it does bring to mind some questions that we might want to ask ourselves as we begin to look at John Stuart Mill. So, Mill is going to come in the tradition of these other British empiricists, such as Hume, Morley, and his father James Mill. And Mill's philosophy is it going to be an empirical one, a utilitarian one, and in some way an anti rationalist one. So let's take a look at this. Mill is going to give us the basis of what's going to become a scientific psychology of the 20th century. His essay on liberty is probably one of the most widely assigned, and indeed it's one of those books you should put on your bucket list. Read On Liberty Before You Die. You'll be better for having done so. It specifically opposes paternalism, which comes from the Latin word pater, meaning father. I'm your dad, and I know what's best for you. Mill's system of logic is a guide to experimental science, and he defends utilitarianism in probably its most clear form. Okay, so one of the other unique things about Mill is that he co-wrote a lot of his works with his wife and actually gave her credit, which was kind of uncommon at the time. Mill had been homeschooled, had a grounding in Greek and Latin, had a nervous breakdown fairly young, was a strident atheist despite studying for the ministry, worked as a writer for profit, and he composed an authoritative history of India. Early influences on him included Jeremy Bentham, here on the left, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet in the center, and the French writer Auguste Comte, who, while he comes after the French philosophes that we discussed, is going to be another important philosophic thinker. He's going to develop what we call positivism. So let's understand that word. Okay, we don't need to worry a whole lot about this, but this is probably the best way to understand it. Comte's use of positivism is kind of divergent by how it's normally used. His basic idea is this: that human thought, as it addresses pressing problems, passes through three distinct stages: on an individual level, on a group level, on a mass level, etc. The theological, the metaphysical, and the positive. So the theological is where our idea structures of people are dominated by supernatural entities, and priests rule society. So this would be, um, you know, any primitive society or even relatively modern society that has this kind of structure. The metaphysical, where our ideas are shaped by abstractions, ideas about ideas, and lawyers rule society, or at least those who interpret the abstractions. And then finally, the positive or the scientific stage. Now, all the cognitive structures are built on the basis of facts that we can discover through science, verify through experimentation, observation, logic, and so forth. So, the first of these, when we're in superstition, now we're kind of thinking about the occult. We've got supernatural agents sort of directing things from behind closed doors. In the second stage, we have kind of a demystified set of beliefs, but we still try and explain things. And then in the third, everything gives way and the mind applies itself to studying natural laws. In the final state, we're all supposed to become Humeans. And this is central because Mill's philosophy is mapped onto Hume's, and so he's going to follow Comte fairly closely here. Now, positivism is also used with philosophy of law, such as legal positivism. Now, a third sense gets kind of closer to here what we've got. The guy up in the right with the righteous beard is Ernst Mach. So if you watch fighter pilot movies and they're going Mach 1, Mach 2, that's who it's named for. Okay. He's a physics professor at the University of Vienna late in the 19th century. He's going to write an analysis on sensation and basically say that you know when you're doing science because you're not doing metaphysics. So science is everything that is not philosophy. I don't know, maybe a stretch, but kind of an interesting way to view the world. So John Stuart Mill is promoting a philosophy of science that goes along with Mach and has this very positivistic view of science. Science is what takes place when we experience things. It's an empirical enterprise. We see it, taste it, touch it, hear it, smell it, and so forth. So Mill is going to say that matter is really just the permanent possibility of sensation. Reality exists in an ontological sense because it's the subject of experience. The cup that is on the desk in front of me exists because, well, I can touch it and drink from it, and so on and so forth. Now, Mill's going to reject the rationalist arguments of philosophy, saying introspection just doesn't go too far. If you look within yourself, you're only going to find what you already know. You might incorrectly conclude that your awareness is some sort of intuition when it may not be. So, Mill is going to place in opposition to this what he calls the psychological method, that we learn things in the present by being presented with what's to be learned. In this case, the philosophies of Nietzsche and Mill. We rehearse them through repeated presentations. You are welcome to watch this video over and over if you like, and forming necessary associations. You hear Nietzsche, maybe you think about the Apollonian, the Dionysian. You hear Mill, maybe you think about positivism, utilitarianism, or liberty. Mill is very much echoing Hume here. Okay? With Mill, our problem of knowledge kind of solves itself in a very empiricistic way. We experiment. We see, we taste, we touch, we hear, we smell, and we know. When he's talking about logic, he actually says, well, we can follow a procedure for experimental science. It looks kind of like this. And it looks tricky, but it's not. So let's look at that top bullet point there. According to concomitance, which just means that two things are committed at the same time, A is the cause of B. Whenever in presenting A, we can bring B about. The flipping on of light switches is the cause of lights coming on in a room. Whenever presenting flipping on of light switches, we can bring lights coming on in a room about. Method of agreement has us look at all the factors present whenever B occurs. So the lights come on in a room. Are there any switches up? Is it dark outside that room? And so on. The method of difference kind of works similarly. Now we look to see if there's an event whose presence is always the case when something occurs, but if it's not there, then whatever occurs isn't there. So if the switches aren't on, the lights aren't on. If the lights aren't on, chances are the switches aren't on. All of these are different methods and refinements. So in the end, he's going to use a manipulability hypothesis, which sounds kind of impressive. And it's going to crown the entire thing. A causes B. When taking B to be an empirical feature of the world, that is, we can observe it, A can be used to manipulate that feature of the world. Light switches are the cause of lights, when lights are something that we observe, and I can manipulate switches to manipulate that feature. In terms of ethics, our problem of conduct, Mill says the right test ethically isn't whether something holds up in our logic, that is, whether it makes sense to us and we can think it through, but rather does it hold up in real life? That is, so it doesn't matter what you think to yourself, you would always do this or you would never do that. What really matters is, could you do that in a practical application? What we do, chiefly as creatures of nature, is we try and maximize our pleasure and minimize our pains, and that holds up in real life, no matter what we might think otherwise. What Mill concludes is that most of our human activity is grounded in utility. I want to do what is most useful, what brings about pleasure, and what helps me avoid pain. But Mill doesn't want to be understood in just saying that it's a standard by which we judge all ethical content of actions. In other words, he says, don't be an Epicurean. The eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die. He'd say if you're trying to assign utilities to courses of action, that is, figure out what the best thing to do in a given situation is, what you should do is whatever makes life more meaningful, more developed, more purposive, and more under rational control. The ultimate pain is a life that isn't authentically one's own. So maybe here we hear a little bit of Goethe, a little bit of Fichte, possibly a little bit of Schiller. And what is profoundly useful is to live a meaningful and fully lived life. In the same connection, Mill says we develop this sense of duty, the Greek word for which is deon, deontology comes from this, which is the chief motive that pushes us to promote the general welfare, or making as many pleasures for as many people as we possibly can. Mill's position on freedom is very similar. If the wildest, most pernicious, degrading view is false, the way we discover its falsity is by exposing it to criticism. If instead what seems to be patently false, reckless, destructive turns out to be true, it's a truth that we would deny ourselves if we allowed us to be silenced by a censor. So on the right there, you have a whole bunch of banned books, and the logic behind it was we can't let people read these books, they'll get bad ideas. Mill would come along and say, read these books and develop your ideas for yourself rather than letting someone else ostensibly know better than you do. So John Stuart Mill presents a liberal position. Now, when we say liberal, we don't mean like modern liberals leftists. We mean liberal like based in liberty. Freedom of inquiry, freedom of expression, free marketplace of ideas. This is going to be the engine of progress now. No one's ideas, by virtue of their personal authority, so say my doctorates or someone being the mayor, the governor, or what have you, take precedence over anyone else's. Instead, precedence is won by being earned, and it's earned by being useful and what finally works in the public interest for the general good of all people. Liberty is going to extend to a liberty of conscience, because anyone can be wrong, and certainly may be wrong at a level of basic moral ideas. So everyone has a right, because they have autonomy, remember autonomos, self-law, self-guided, self-governed, and so forth, and dignity, to frame a form of life that makes sense for them. There aren't any limits on this until you start to include other people. Liberty has to be used in such a way as not to limit the liberty of others. So this is as far as we go with Nietzsche and Mill. I hope you found this interesting and will give this some thought. Thank you and have a great evening. Bye-bye.